Yeah, and I mean, I think we were talking just before the camera started rolling about how a lot of the mainstream outlets will focus on the Trump factor, and we'll certainly get into that. But I think, I mean, from my perspective, it's really about the financial system. And I want to go back to the transformation that Deutsche has made over the last 20, 25 years to get a sense of how that bank's transformed and how that's emblematic of the transformation that we've seen in the system. I mean, what did Deutsche Bank look like before it became this giant financial behemoth?
So let me just say before I even answer that I think that's like a really good approach, because Deutsche Bank in a lot of ways, it's an interesting tale of its rise and fall, but it also is just this nearly perfect case study in how not to run a major global financial institution or a major global company of any nature, really. So I think it's a pretty interesting tale. So Deutsche Bank was founded in 1870. This is its 150th birthday. Happy birthday, Deutsche Bank. And it was founded as basically an institution that was supposed to help German companies spread their wings internationally. And this was the dawn of the industrial era. And so there were big, proud German companies like Siemens in particular that were looking for a German bank that could help them help finance their projects all over the world, really. And so that's what Deutsche Bank was doing. It was also financing infrastructure projects really basically in most continents, in South America, in the US, all over Europe and Asia. And so it was a pretty traditional institutional lender that was really helping the economy grow at a point in world history where there's a lot of economic growth to be had. And that trajectory went on basically uninterrupted for about 6 decades. And Deutsche Bank was becoming one of the biggest banks in the world, even at that point. And this is obviously an era before globalization. So banks were much more national or continental in nature than they are today. But it was becoming one of the biggest, most important financiers of infrastructure and development and industrial projects anywhere in the world. And then in the 1930s, the Nazis come to power in Germany, and Deutsche Bank goes from being this kind of international development bank to being the financial wing of the Nazi Party, essentially. And it helps bankroll the German military. It helps pay for the construction of concentration camps. It helps pay for the manufacture of poison gas and for selling gold, some of which was extracted from the teeth of Jews for the Nazis all over Europe and Asia. And so it very quickly goes from being this global bank to being one that is focused on helping Germany take over the globe. Which, in fairness to Deutsche Bank, was something a lot of big German companies were doing at the time.
And they were basically co-opted into it because, state capitalism, that's what the National Socialism was, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Although I would argue, especially with the benefit of hindsight, that this was an institution, and these were executives at this institution who got pretty caught up in it as well. They were not members of the Nazi Party, but one of the bank's leaders at the time was serving on the board, not just of Deutsche Bank, but of the chemical company that was manufacturing the gas. So this is not a case of them just following orders. This is a case of them looking to continue to thrive in an era where thriving meant being complicit in genocide. So that's a trade that they made. And after the war, they were accused, the institution was accused of being a war criminal, and its leader was convicted of being a war criminal. And the US tried to liquidate the bank, and that would have been the end of Deutsche Bank, except that the British government, which was still owed reparations from World War I from Germany, really wanted Deutsche Bank to exist and to help basically pull Germany out of this deep depression that was in, help rebuild Germany, and help rebuild and reunite Europe. And so the Brits prevailed, and Deutsche Bank over the next several decades became, once again, one of the leading financiers of development, infrastructure, and kind of corporate projects all over Europe. And it played a really leading, important role in the reconstruction, redevelopment, and ultimately the reunification of Europe.
Right. And where were the French, by the way, during that period of time? What were they thinking about? Because my understanding is they were against letting the Germans sort of rise up, if you will.
Yeah, the French had some trust issues with the Germans at that point. It's interesting. I actually don't know the answer to what the French view on the liquidation versus maintenance of Deutsche Bank was. And it was interesting because Berlin obviously was split into quadrants, right?
Right.
And the Deutsche Bank's old headquarters happened to be in the British quadrant. And that was a very fateful, kind of random outcome, but it meant that the Brits ultimately were the ones who had a say over what was going to happen with this bank. And so it didn't just get right back to normal. It was actually split into 10 or 11 different little institutions, but they all continued to operate basically under the Deutsche Bank umbrella. And within less than 10 years, they were legally and formally reunited themselves.
And Deutsche Bank, Deutsche means German, and when people think of the bank that is Germany, that's the first bank that they think of. So the leading German bank in terms of, as you said, bringing Europe back together, reunification. When we get to the reunification period and beyond, what does Deutsche Bank look like compared to, say, other national banks, the likes of UBS or of BNP Paribas and those kinds of institutions?
Through the 1980s, the banking industry was really a pale comparison of what it became in the 90s, 2000s, and even today. And these kind of leading national champion banks, whether it's in Germany or Switzerland or France or the UK, are really much more traditional lenders than what we've seen today. I mean, they're providing slightly different services depending on the geography. I mean, the Swiss were always really big in wealth management, for example. But these were banks that had, in Deutsche Bank's case, a limited retail presence. So they'd been founded, by the way, with zero interest in serving retail customers. This is purely an institutional focused bank. And it remained that way for the most part. And they did have a retail franchise, but it was not that exciting, in part because retail banking in Germany is not very lucrative. And I think the same goes for the international footprint of a BNP Paribas or a UBS or a Deutsche Bank. It was in serving big companies from their home countries and from the continent, helping them finance projects overseas. And it was a pretty plain vanilla type of business activity. And that increasingly into the late 80s became a problem for banks like Deutsche Bank because the world was globalizing at this point, and it was becoming much easier for investors to, whether they were in Germany or the US or Hong Kong, to have a choice in where they put their money. And if they wanted a certain amount of exposure to a big international bank, they obviously are going to look for the investment opportunity that presents the highest returns. So if you're an investor that's in Germany, but in usage it's automatically have a choice between 2 or 3 big German banks, you've now got a menu that spans the globe pretty much. And so banks like Deutsche Bank were looking and watching with increasing envy and alarm as US banks, especially the old Wall Street partnerships, converted into publicly traded companies and were just minting money and had returns on equity that were orders of magnitude higher than what Deutsche Bank was achieving. And the same goes for UBS or BNP Paribas or any number, Barclays in the UK. And so the solution to that at the time was pretty simple. It was that banks like Deutsche Bank needed to get into the same game that allowed the Goldmans and the JP Morgans and the Citigroups of the world to be just raking in the revenue, and that was Wall Street. And it was investment banking, it was sales and trading, and it just opened up this entire new world of opportunity for these banks.